He thought he would never be a father, until he entered a hospital room and saw the woman he loved giving birth to 3 babies who weren't his. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel. We post every day. Continuing, Raphael Miller always knew he was born to save lives. At 38, he was London's most respected cardiovascular surgeon, owner of the Cardium Hospital Group, which spread across the country with cutting-edge technology and first-class care. His name was etched on golden plaques in the corridors of the best hospitals. His hands were considered blessed by the medical community, and his bank account had more zeros than most people could count in a lifetime. His apartment in Mayfair was a reflection of everything he had achieved. Glass, steel, and marble formed clean lines that stretched across 300 square meters of pure luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city that pulsed 24 hours a day, and every object within had been hand-picked by renowned decorators. But nothing in that impeccable environment was more precious to Raphael than the moments spent with Helen. Helen Christina had brown hair that naturally waved over, her shoulders, green eyes that sparkled when she smiled, and a contagious laugh that could make Raphael forget even the heaviest days in the operating room. They met 3 years earlier at a charity dinner at the Ritz, London, during one of his trips to Edinburgh. She worked as a social projects coordinator for a large multinational and had organized the event. When their eyes met for the first time, across the crowd of elegantly dressed people, Raphael felt something he had never experienced before. The absolute certainty that he had found the woman of his life. Their courtship was intense from the start. Helen moved to London 6 months later, leaving behind a promising career in Edinburgh to build a life with him. It wasn't a sacrifice, she always made a point of clarifying, but a conscious choice from someone who had found her lifelong partner. She secured a position at an NGO that worked with underprivileged children, and Raphael loved coming home to find her in the kitchen, preparing a new recipe she had learned, telling him about her day with the enthusiasm of someone who truly believed she could change the world. The marriage proposal happened on a December night on the apartment's terrace, with the city twinkling like a sea of stars in the background. Raphael had planned every detail, her favorite flowers scattered across the floor, aromatic candles creating a magical atmosphere, and a diamond ring he had specially commissioned for the moment. When Helen said yes, crying tears of emotion, Raphael was certain his life was complete. They then began planning the wedding. It would be an elegant but intimate ceremony, with 200 carefully selected guests in the chapel of the Fasano Hotel, followed by a reception in the garden. Helen spent weeks choosing every detail, the flowers, the menu, the decor, the music. More than that, she spent even more time dreaming of the family they would build together. She wanted at least 2 children, maybe 3, a house with a garden where they could play, beach vacations, lazy family Sundays. Raphael shared these dreams with the same intensity. He always imagined himself as a father, teaching a child to ride a bike, helping with homework, being the kind of present father he himself never had. His father, also a doctor, had been a distant man, always working, always absent during important moments. Raphael promised himself that he would be different, that he would find the perfect balance between a successful career and family life. It was Helen who first suggested they consult a specialist doctor. They had been trying to conceive for over a year without success. Maybe it's just anxiety, Raphael would say, trying to reassure his fiancée and himself. We're too anxious. That can interfere. But deep down, an uncomfortable feeling began to form in his stomach. As a doctor, he knew that after a year of unprotected attempts, it was advisable to investigate. The appointment was scheduled with Dr. Edward Sampson, one of London's best human reproduction specialists, a colleague of Raphael's since medical school. The office was in a modern clinic in the Kensington area, with light walls and minimalist decor that tried to disguise the anxiety all patients carried when walking through that door. "We'll do a complete investigation on both of you," explained Dr. Edward, with the serene professionalism of someone who dealt daily with the frustration and hope of couples dreaming of parenthood. "We'll start with basic tests and then move on to more specific investigations if necessary." Helen had her tests first. Transvaginal, ultrasound, hormonal dosages, hysterosalpingography. All normal. More than normal, in fact. Polycystic ovaries, excellent ovarian reserve, unobstructed fallopian tubes. You have every reason to be a mother without problems, Dr. Edward said, smiling at her during the results consultation. Now let's check Raphael. The sperm analysis was the first test. Raphael collected the sample on a Tuesday morning before heading to a complex surgery that would last 8 hours. He was confident, in fact. He had always considered himself a healthy man, exercised regularly, didn't smoke, drank socially, maintained a balanced diet. There was no reason for concern. The result arrived 3 days later, via email while Raphael was reviewing patient records in his hospital office. He opened the PDF file and felt the world collapse around him. Azoospermia, 0 sperm in the ejaculate. He read the result 3 times, imagining he had misunderstood. But there was no possible error. The number was there, implacable, 0. Dr. Edward asked to repeat the test. Sometimes there's a lab error, he said, but his voice didn't carry the conviction of his words. The second result was identical, 0. The third also. It was then that they moved on to more specific tests, hormonal dosages, testicular biopsy, MRI. 2 weeks of intensive investigation that culminated in a devastating diagnosis: severe obstructive azoospermia, likely congenital, with multiple obstructions that made any attempt at surgical recovery practically impossible. Look, Raphael, Dr. Edwards said during the final consultation, technically there's a minimal chance we could get some sperm through very invasive surgical procedures, but honestly, with your condition, the chances are practically nil. We're talking about less than 1%. Raphael heard the words as if from far away. Azoospermia, male infertility, inability to have biological children. The words echoed in his mind like a terminal diagnosis, and in a way he felt it was exactly that, the death of a dream he had nurtured his whole life. But there are alternatives, Dr. Edward continued. Sperm donation is a very viable option nowadays. Sperm banks have donors with physical characteristics similar to yours, higher education, rigorous medical screening. Many couples choose this alternative and have beautiful, happy families. Raphael nodded mechanically but wasn't really listening. His mind had disconnected from reality, floating in a dark place where all his certainties had crumbled. He scheduled a new appointment for the following week, when he would return with Helen to discuss the options, picked up the test results and left the office like a ghost. The drive back home was a blur of traffic and horns. Raphael drove on autopilot, his mind processing the diagnosis in every possible way. As a doctor, he perfectly understood the clinical situation. As a man, as a future husband and father, he felt completely lost. His entire masculine identity seemed to have been questioned in that piece of paper, with numbers and medical terms. Helen was in the kitchen when he arrived, preparing dinner and humming softly to a song playing on the radio. She wore a floral apron he had given her the month before, and her hair was tied in a messy ponytail that made her even more beautiful. When she saw him, her face lit up with that smile that always managed to calm any storm in his life. "Hi, love," she said, approaching to kiss him. "How was your day? I'm making that pasta you love, with shrimp sauce." Raphael kissed her mechanically, tasting the salt of his own unshed tears. "Helen, we need to talk." She stopped what she was doing immediately. His tone of voice, his closed expression, his tense posture, everything indicated something was wrong. "Of course, love. What happened?" They sat on the living room sofa, facing the city view that normally calmed him, but now seemed only cold and distant. Raphael held Helen's hands, gathering strength to say what needed to be said. "My test results came back," he began, his voice lower than normal. I have a problem. A serious problem." Helen felt her heart race, but maintained a serene expression. "What kind of problem, Raphael? We can solve it together, whatever it is." "I'm infertile, Helen." The words came out, like a confession laden with shame and defeat. "Completely infertile. I can't have biological children. Never." The silence that followed seemed to have its own weight, filling the space between them with an almost physical density. Helen processed the information for a few seconds, her green eyes filling with tears not for the news itself, but for the suffering she saw etched on the face of the man she loved. "It's okay," she finally said, squeezing his hands tighter. "It's okay, Raphael. This changes nothing between us, nothing at all." "How does it change nothing?" Raphael exploded, getting up from the sofa and beginning to pace. "How can you say it changes nothing? I can't give you children. I can't build a family with you. I can't—" "Raphael, stop!" Helen interrupted, standing up too. "You're being absurd. There are other ways for us to have children. Sperm donation, adoption, in vitro fertilization." "Children who won't be mine," he shouted, the pain finally leaking through his anger. "Children who will carry another man's DNA. How do you not understand that this is unacceptable?" Helen approached him, trying to touch him, but Raphael recoiled as if her touch burned. "Raphael, listen to what you're saying. Parenthood isn't about DNA, it's about love, care, presence. You can be a wonderful father regardless of—" "No," he cut her off. "You don't understand. A man needs to pass on his genes. He needs to leave a legacy. That's what defines us as men, Helen. That's ridiculous." Now it was Helen's turn to get agitated. "You're talking like we live in 1950. Parenthood is much more than genetics, Raphael. You know that." But Raphael was lost in his own private hell, where decades of social conditioning about masculinity and fatherhood had created a trap from which he couldn't escape. In his mind, being sterile was equivalent to being less of a man. It was a fundamental flaw in his masculine identity. "You deserve to have biological children," he finally said, his voice now low and defeated. "You deserve to marry a man who can give you a real family, who can truly make you happy." "Raphael, you're talking nonsense." Helen was crying now, frustrated and scared by the turn the conversation had taken. "I love you. I want to build a life with you, with or without biological children. Why can't you understand that?" But he had already made his decision, in that dark, irrational place where wounded pride and fear mixed in a toxic combination. If he couldn't be the man Helen deserved, then she needed to be freed to find someone who could. "I'm cancelling the wedding," he said, the words coming out like precise shots. "And I'm ending our relationship. You deserve to be happy, Helen, and I can't give you that happiness." Helen was silent for a long moment, looking at him with an expression that mixed disbelief, pain, and anger. "You're abandoning me," she finally said. "You're abandoning me. Because you found out you have a medical condition. That's what you're doing, Raphael." "I'm setting you free," he replied, but his voice trembled with the lie he knew he was telling himself. "No," Helen said, taking off her engagement ring and placing it on the coffee table with a deliberate gesture. "You're running away. You're being cowardly, and you're using my happiness as an excuse for your cowardice." She went to the bedroom, packed a bag with her essentials, picked up Muffin, the orange cat she had adopted the year before, and left the apartment without another word. Raphael stood in the living room, looking at the abandoned ring on the table, feeling as if a part of his soul had been forcibly torn out. In the weeks that followed, Raphael threw himself into work with an intensity that worried even his closest colleagues. He arrived at the hospital at 5 in the morning and left after midnight. He accepted all complex cases, all extra shifts, anything that could keep his mind busy and away from the pain that threatened to consume him. But no matter how much he tried to distract himself, reminders of Helen were everywhere. The apartment still carried her scent, her clothes still occupied half the closet, her beauty products were still scattered in the bathroom. Raphael couldn't bring himself to remove these things. It was as if, by eliminating them, he was definitively admitting that everything was over. One night, 3 months after the breakup, he finally gathered the courage to call her. The phone rang several times before she answered, and when she finally did, her voice sounded different, more distant, firmer. "Hello? Helen, it's me." Silence. "Raphael," she finally said. "Why are you calling?" I wanted to know how you are. I'm fine," she cut him off. "I'm rebuilding my life. Something you should do too." "Helen, He tried to find words to express the regret that consumed him, the emptiness he felt every day, the growing certainty that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. "Raphael, no," she said, her voice firm but not cruel. "You made your choice. Now live with it, and let me live with mine." The call ended, and Raphael stood holding the phone in the silence of the empty apartment. It was at that moment that he understood there was no going back. Helen had moved on, exactly as he had insisted she should, and now he would have to learn to live with the consequences of his decision. Meanwhile, across the city, Helen hung up the phone and returned to the small table where she worked on her laptop. She had moved to a smaller apartment in Shoreditch, a bohemian neighborhood full of bars, cafes, and bookstores. It was a completely different environment from the sterile luxury of Mayfair, but it was hers. She had left the NGO and was trying to build a new career as a cultural event organizer, starting small but with big dreams. The pain was still there, certainly. Some mornings she would wake up and for a few seconds forget that she was no longer Raphael's fiancée, that she wouldn't be getting married the following month, that the whole life they had planned together had crumbled. But she was determined not to let a man's cowardice define the rest of her life. Muffin climbed onto her lap, purring softly as she stroked his orange fur. "It's just the two of us now, Kitty," she whispered to him, "but we'll be fine, we always are." Outside the window, London continued to pulse with life, and Helen was determined to be part of that pulse again, to find her own happiness, her own dreams. Raphael had made his choice, based on fear and wounded pride. Now it was time for her to make her own choices, based on courage and hope. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in months, Helen felt she had control over it, and that, as frightening as it was also liberating. 18 months had passed since Helen left the Mayfair apartment, carrying only a suitcase and her cat. 18 months of slow and deliberate reconstruction, of discovering who she was when not defined by a relationship, of learning to be happy alone before allowing anyone else into her life. The apartment in Shoreditch had become a true home. It was small, only 2 bedrooms, but Helen had decorated every corner with care and creativity. Plants hung from the windows, books piled up on makeshift shelves, and the walls were covered with travel photos, paintings bought at local art fairs, and posters of cultural events she had organized. It was chaotic, colorful, alive, everything her previous life was not. Muffin had adapted perfectly to the new environment, spending hours at the window watching the street movement, which was infinitely more interesting than the static view of the mirrored buildings of the previous neighborhood. There, Helen could observe real people living real lives, students rushing to university, artists carrying instruments, young couples sharing beer at corner pubs, children playing in the square in front of the building. The career change had been daring but necessary. Helen could no longer imagine herself in corporate offices with their endless meetings about spreadsheets and sales targets. She needed something that fed her, soul that made her wake up in the morning wanting to work, that connected with the part of her that always believed she could make a difference in the world. That's how she discovered the Literary Café, a cultural space located on a quiet street 2 blocks from her home. The place was a perfect mix of cafe, bookstore, and cultural center, with exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books of all categories, comfortable armchairs scattered in the corners, and a small stage where poetry readings, musical performances, and book launches took place. Marlene, the owner, was a 60-year-old woman with grey hair tied in a perpetually messy bun, large glasses resting on the tip of her nose, and a warm smile that made anyone feel at home. She had opened the cafe after retiring from teaching, using all her savings to create a space where literature and community could meet. Helen started as a regular customer, spending entire afternoons there, reading, working on her laptop, or simply observing the constant flow of interesting people who frequented the place. Artists, writers, students, intellectuals, people who had deep conversations about books, movies, politics, life. It was exactly the kind of environment that had always attracted her, but which she never had the courage to explore when she was trapped in the proper, predictable life of a successful doctor's fiancé. It was during a poetry reading on a rainy Thursday that Marlene approached her with a proposal. "Helen, dear," she said, sitting in the armchair next to hers, "for weeks I've seen you here, organizing events on your laptop, taking notes on everything that happens. Tell me, what's your background? Helen explained her experience in project management, about the corporate and social events she had coordinated in Edinburgh and London, about her dream of working with culture. Marlene listened attentively, nodding occasionally, a smile growing on her face. "What if I told you I need someone exactly with your profile?" she asked. "Someone who can help me expand the cultural programming here, organize bigger events, partnerships with publishers, literary festivals. The cafe is growing, but I can't handle it alone anymore." That's how Helen became a managing partner of the Literary Cafe. It wasn't a job that would pay the bills for the Mayfair apartment, but it was more than enough for her new life in Shoreditch, and more importantly, it was a job that made her happy. She woke up every morning eager to get to the cafe, to see what new projects they could develop, what partnerships they could form, what events they could create. Under Helen's management, the cafe's programming diversified enormously. She organized themed nights of contemporary British literature, short story reading sessions, creative writing workshops, book launches by independent authors, and even a book club that met every Friday to discuss classics and new releases in national and international literature. It was during one of these events, a contemporary poetry book signing night, that she met Daniel Cooper. He was sitting at the back of the cafe, notes scattered across the table, a long cold cup of coffee next to an old laptop full of stickers. He had dark hair a little too long, thick-rimmed glasses, and wore an indie band t-shirt Helen didn't know under a blazer that had seen better days. What caught her attention wasn't his appearance, but the intensity with which he observed the poets performing on stage. He took notes constantly, smiled at the right moments, and had an expression Helen immediately recognized, that of someone who truly understood and appreciated art. When the event ended and the last guests were leaving, Helen approached his table to collect the cups and discovered he had forgotten a notebook. It was a black moleskin, slightly crumpled, full of handwritten notes in tiny, hurried script. "Excuse me," she said, approaching him already at the cafe door. "You forgot this." Daniel turned, and when their eyes met, Helen felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, that small spark of interest, of curiosity about another person. It wasn't the overwhelming passion she had felt for Raphael the first time she saw him, but something more subtle, more mature. "Thank you," he said, taking the notebook with a genuine smile. "I would have missed it greatly. It's my notebook for the book I'm writing." "You're a writer." "Aspiring writer," he corrected, with a modesty Helen found charming. "I haven't published anything yet, but I'm working on my first novel. It's about—" He hesitated, as if unsure if she really wanted to hear. "It's about people who get lost and find themselves in London. About how a city can be both the place where you feel most alone and the place where you discover who you really are." Helen smiled. "That sounds quite personal." "All good literature is personal," Daniel replied. "At least that's what I believe." They talked for a few more minutes at the cafe door, about literature, about London, about life. Helen discovered he was 35, had moved to the city 5 years earlier from a small town in the English countryside, and worked as a freelancer, creating content for websites while pursuing his dream of becoming a novelist. He had been married, had divorced 2 years earlier, when he discovered that he and his ex-wife wanted completely different things from life. When they finally said goodbye, Helen realized she was smiling alone as she closed the cafe. It wasn't just the interesting conversation, but something in the way Daniel spoke, the genuine passion in his eyes when discussing literature, the honest vulnerability with which he had spoken about his life. Daniel returned to the cafe the following week, and the next, and the next. He always ordered the same coffee, double espresso, no sugar, always sat at the same table in the back, and always worked intensely on his laptop, stopping only to greet Helen when she passed by. Gradually, these casual interactions turned into longer conversations. Helen discovered that Daniel had read practically everything in contemporary British literature, that he had fascinating opinions about authors she admired, and that he possessed a worldview that was both intellectual and deeply human. "Why did you choose London to write?" she asked him on a Saturday afternoon when the cafe was calmer and she could sit at his table for a longer chat. Daniel looked out the window, observing the street movement. "Because London is a city of refugees," he said. not war refugees, but refugees from life. People who came here, fleeing something, seeking something. There's a particular melancholy in London that I don't find in other cities, a loneliness that paradoxically unites people. And what were you fleeing when you came here? He smiled, but there was sadness in that smile. A life too small for the dreams I had, a marriage that had become more of a social obligation than an emotional choice, a town where everyone knew who I was before I even discovered who I wanted to be. Helen understood perfectly. And did you find what you were looking for? I'm still looking, he admitted. But at least here I can search in peace. Their conversations became deliberate encounters. Daniel began helping Helen with some of the cafe's events, especially those related to literature. He had a network of independent writers, new authors who were launching first books, knew what the trends in national literature were. Together they organized some of the literary cafe's most successful nights. It was during the organization of a micro-fiction festival that Helen realized she was falling in love. It wasn't the kind of dramatic passion she had experienced with Raphael, but something more consistent, more secure. Daniel listened when she spoke, remembered small details from previous conversations, asked questions that showed genuine interest in who she was as a person. More importantly, he never tried to change anything about her. He didn't suggest she go back to her corporate career because it was more financially secure, didn't question her life choices, didn't try to mold her to fit some predetermined vision of what a woman should be. He accepted her exactly as she was, with her neuroses, her ambitions, her contradictions. The first kiss happened in the early hours of the morning after a particularly successful event. They had stayed late, tidying up the cafe, putting away extra chairs, washing cups, counting the event's money. Marlene had left earlier, leaving them alone in the silent space lit only by the yellowish lights of the bookshelves. "Tonight was amazing," Helen said, collapsing into one of the armchairs with a sigh of satisfied exhaustion. "I don't think we've ever had so many people at an event here." Daniel sat in the armchair next to her, a tired smile on his face. "You're incredible at organizing these things. You have an energy that's contagious. It's not just me, we work well together." "We really do," he agreed, and there was something different in his voice, something lower, more intimate. When Helen looked at him, she realized he was observing her with an expression she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just professional admiration or friendship. It was romantic interest, pure and simple, and when she realized it, she knew she felt exactly the same way. The kiss was soft, hesitant at first, as if both were testing if it was real, if it was what they both truly wanted. When they separated, Helen smiled. "How long have you wanted to do that?" she asked. "Since the first time you gave me back my notebook," Daniel admitted. "And you? Since you explained why you chose London to write." They laughed together, and Helen felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, the feeling of being in the right place, with the right person at the right time. The relationship evolved naturally from that night. Daniel started spending more time at Helen's apartment, bringing books he wanted her to read, cooking simple but delicious dinners, spending hours talking to her about everything and nothing. Muffin accepted him immediately, which Helen considered a great sign. They didn't rush. They didn't make grand plans for the future, didn't talk about marriage or children in the first few weeks. They simply enjoyed each other's company, the ease of living together, the comforting feeling of having found someone who truly understood her. Daniel was different from Raphael in every aspect. Where Raphael was ambitious and impatient, Daniel was contemplative and patient. Where Raphael planned every detail of life with surgical precision, Daniel lived more in the present, more in the moment. Where Raphael defined himself by professional success and social status, Daniel defined himself by the passion he felt for art and literature. But more importantly, Daniel had gone through his own losses, his own disappointments. He knew what it was like to have broken dreams, relationships that didn't work out, the feeling of having to start from scratch. This shared experience of pain and reconstruction created an emotional intimacy between them that Helen had never experienced before. 6 months after meeting, they were officially dating. Helen had introduced Daniel to Marlene, who immediately approved of him. "He has kind eyes," was her verdict. and he had introduced Helen to his writer and artist friends, who found her intelligent and interesting. Life was good, better than Helen allowed herself to imagine it could be again. The cafe prospered, her relationship with Daniel deepened every day, and she had built a solid network of friends in the neighborhood. She had an active social life, participated in cultural events, discovered new authors, occasionally traveled to literary festivals in other cities. It was during one of these trips, a weekend in Hay-on-Wye for the town's literary festival, that Helen realized she was late. Not much, just a few days, but enough to make a small seed of possibility germinate in her mind. She bought a home pregnancy test as soon as they returned to London, but didn't have the courage to take it immediately. She kept the box in the bathroom drawer and tried to convince herself it was just stress, a change in routine, anything but what her heart secretly hoped it was. 3 days later, on a Sunday morning when Daniel had gone out to buy bread at the corner bakery, she finally gathered the courage. She took the test and waited the longest 3 minutes of her life, pacing back and forth in the small apartment bathroom, Muffin watching her. Comings and goings with feline curiosity. 2 lines, positive, pregnant. Helen sat on the edge of the bathtub, looking at the test in her hands, feeling a mix of joy, fear, and anticipation that made her almost dizzy. She was pregnant. Finally, after wanting it for so long, she was pregnant. She heard the key in the door and Daniel's voice calling her name. She quickly hid the test in the drawer and came out of the bathroom trying to appear normal, but surely failing miserably. "Is everything okay?" Daniel asked, placing the bread in the kitchen and coming to meet her. "You look pale." "I'm fine," Helen lied, still processing the news. "Just a little tired." But throughout the rest of the day, she couldn't stop thinking. How would Daniel react? They had never specifically talked about having children together. They had talked vaguely about the future, about plans to perhaps officially live together, about the possibility of Daniel publishing his book. But children? That had never been a specific conversation. Helen spent the next week planning how to tell him. She wanted it to be special, romantic, memorable. She decided she would make a special dinner at the apartment, cook his favorite dish, buy a good bottle of wine, which she obviously wouldn't drink, and tell him the news during dessert. The chosen night was a Friday. Daniel arrived at the apartment after a day working at the public library, where he had managed to reserve a quiet table to write. He found Helen in the kitchen wearing a dress he loved, preparing mushroom risotto with a dedication she normally reserved for special events. "What special occasion is this?" he asked, approaching her from behind and kissing her neck. "Can't it just be because I wanted to do something special for you?" she replied, turning in his arms. "It can," he said, smiling, "but you're nervous. I can tell when you're nervous. You keep touching your hair constantly, like you're doing now." Helen laughed, realizing he knew her better than she imagined. "Okay, there is a special reason, but you'll have to wait until after dinner to find out what it is." They had dinner talking about their respective days, about an event they were organizing for the following month, about the book Daniel was reading. But Helen could barely concentrate on the conversation, her mind too occupied with what was to come. When they finished the main course and Helen got up to get dessert from the kitchen, she felt her hands trembling slightly. It was now. She returned with 2 glasses of chocolate mousse she had made the night before and took a deep breath. "Daniel," she began, sitting back at the table, "there's something I need to tell you." He stopped eating, noticing the seriousness in her voice. "Go ahead." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "We've been together for 8 months, and they've been the best 8 months of my life. You made me believe again in relationships, in companionship, in true love." Daniel smiled, but there was a cautious expression in his eyes, as if he sensed something important was coming. "And I know we never specifically talked about this, but—" She took another deep breath. "Daniel, I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel remained completely still, the mousse spoon paused in mid-air, his eyes fixed on her but with an expression Helen couldn't decipher. Seconds stretched into hours. "Pregnant," he finally repeated, as if testing the sound of the word. "Yes," Helen said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I found out last week I'm approximately 6 weeks along." Daniel slowly placed the spoon back in the glass, as if each movement needed to be carefully calculated. Helen watched his expression gradually change, hope turning into concern, and concern turning into something very much like panic. "Daniel," she called softly, "can you tell me what you're thinking?" He abruptly got up from the table, beginning to pace back and forth in the small room, a hand repeatedly running through his hair. Helen felt her stomach clench, a familiar and terrible sensation beginning to form. I don't know what to say," he finally spoke. "I didn't expect this, not now." "Not now how?" Helen asked, though she already feared the answer. "Helen, I've barely finished my first book. My financial situation is unstable. I'm still figuring out who I am after my divorce. A baby changes everything." "It does," Helen agreed, standing up too. "But not necessarily for the worse. We can make this work, Daniel. Together." But he was shaking his head, that panicked expression intensifying. "You don't understand. My previous marriage ended exactly because of this. My ex-wife wanted children, wanted to settle down, wanted a traditional life, and I wasn't ready. I'm still not ready." Helen felt as if the ground had disappeared from under her feet. "Are you saying you don't want this baby?" "I'm saying I don't know if I can be a father right now," Daniel replied, stopping his pacing and looking directly at her. "I'm 35, Helen, but I still feel like I'm figuring out how to be a functional adult. How can I be responsible for another life?" "Daniel," Helen said, trying to stay calm, "having children is always scary. No one feels completely prepared, but—" "No," he interrupted. "This isn't about normal fear of being a father. This is about me knowing I don't want to be a father. Not now, maybe never. And I should have been clear about that from the start." Helen was silent for a long moment, processing what she was hearing. It was as if she was reliving a nightmare she had experienced before, only this time it was different. Raphael had rejected her because he couldn't give her children. Daniel was rejecting her because she was giving him a child. "So what are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice lower than she intended. Daniel looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "There are options," he said, his words coming out hesitantly. "Private clinics, discreet procedures. It's still early. It would be simple." "Stop," Helen cut him off, feeling anger begin to boil in her chest. "Stop talking." "Helen, I know it's difficult, but—" "Difficult?" she exploded. "Daniel, you're asking me to abort our baby because you don't feel ready to be a father." "I'm not asking for anything," he replied, also raising his voice. "I'm just pointing out that there are alternatives." "For you, maybe," Helen shouted, "but not for me. This baby isn't just yours, Daniel, it's mine too, and I want to have this child." "And what if I don't want to?" he asked, the question coming out as a challenge. Helen stared at him for a long moment, seeing the man she had learned to love, but recognizing in him the same fear, the same lack of courage she had seen in Raphael 2 years earlier. Different men, different situations, but the same fundamental inability to embrace a change they hadn't planned. "Then you can leave," she said, her voice now cold and firm. "You can leave my life and never come back, because I'm going to have this baby, Daniel, with you or without you." Daniel stood in the middle of the room, clearly torn between what he felt for Helen and the terror that the prospect of fatherhood had awakened in him. "Helen, I love you," he finally said, "but I can't." "Then go," she interrupted. "Now." He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, hesitating only for a moment before turning to her. "Helen, Go," she repeated. Daniel left, closing the door softly behind him. Helen stood in the room for a long moment, one hand unconsciously covering her still imperceptible belly, before finally collapsing into the armchair and crying all the tears she had held back during that terrible conversation. Muffin approached and climbed onto her lap, purring softly as if he knew she needed comfort. "It's just the two of us again, Kitty," she whispered to him, repeating the same words she had said 2 years earlier. "The two of us and the baby now." Outside, London continued its nightlife, indifferent to the personal drama that had unfolded in that small Shoreditch apartment. But Helen, for the second time in less than 3 years, would have to learn to start over. Only this time she wouldn't truly be alone. This time she would have someone to love unconditionally, someone who would depend on her completely, someone she would protect from all the fears and insecurities that seemed to torment the men she had chosen to love. She wiped her tears, ran her hand over her belly once more, and made a silent promise to the baby growing inside her. She would never again allow anyone to make her choose between the love for a person and the love for her own dreams of motherhood. This time she would choose herself and her child above all else. Helen didn't look for Daniel in the days following their argument, nor did he try to contact her. The silence between them was definitive, heavy with all the unsaid words and irrevocable choices made that night. She put the books he had forgotten in the apartment into a cardboard box, along with her t-shirt he liked to wear to sleep, and some photos they had taken together. Not with anger, but with a resigned sadness of someone who finally understood that some men simply cannot rise to the occasion that life places before them. The first person Helen told about the pregnancy was Marlene. She chose a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the cafe was almost empty and they could talk without interruptions. She was nervous not about her business partner's reaction, but about how her new condition would affect the business they had built together. "Marlene, I need to tell you something," she said, sitting at the table where they always had their planning meetings. The older woman took off her glasses, wiped the lenses with the hem of her apron, and looked at Helen with that maternal expression that always managed to calm her. "Go ahead, dear. By your eyes, I imagine it's something important." "I'm pregnant," Helen said simply. She had discovered that the most significant news sometimes needs to be shared without embellishment. Marlene's face instantly lit up. "Oh, Helen, how wonderful," she exclaimed, getting up to hug her. "Congratulations. And Daniel? He must be over the moon." Helen's expression changed, and Marlene immediately realized there was more to the story. She sat down again, waiting. "Daniel, he doesn't want the baby," Helen explained. "In fact, he made it clear he doesn't want to be a father. We ended the relationship." Marlene was silent for a few seconds, processing the information. Then, with the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to understand human complexities, she said, "And you? Do you want this baby?" "More than anything in the world," Helen replied without hesitation. "Then that's all that matters," Marlene declared, reaching out to hold Helen's hand. "The rest is just noise. You're going to be a wonderful mother, and this baby will be lucky to have you." In the months that followed, Marlene became much more than a business partner or friend. She became a kind of maternal figure for Helen, offering advice on pregnancy based on her own experience as a mother of 3 grown children, helping to adapt the cafe so Helen could work comfortably throughout her pregnancy, and providing the kind of emotional support that only someone who truly cares can offer. "When I was pregnant with my first child," Marlene recounted one afternoon while they were organizing books on the shelves, "my husband was so nervous he fainted during one of the prenatal appointments. Men have a very complicated relationship with motherhood. Some grow into the responsibility, others run away. It's not about you, Helen, it's about them." Helen discovered there was a support network she didn't even know existed. The regular patrons of the cafe, writers, artists, intellectuals, mothers who worked in the neighborhood, naturally mobilized around her. They brought books about motherhood, shared stories of their own pregnancies, offered tips on where to find the best baby products at affordable prices. "My daughter was born here in the neighborhood, at St. Bartholomew's Hospital," said Felicity, a freelance journalist who frequented the cafe daily. "It's an excellent public hospital, but if you want something more private, there's St. Helens Hospital, which is about 20 minutes from here." Helen opted for private care, not for status reasons, but because she wanted control over all aspects of her pregnancy. She chose an obstetrician recommended by Marlene, Dr. Patricia Allen, a 50-year-old woman with a humanized approach to childbirth and solid experience with high-risk pregnancies. "How old are you?" Dr. Patricia asked during the first consultation. 32. "First pregnancy?" "Yes." "Any family history of complications during childbirth?" Helen hesitated. She had never really investigated her family's medical history. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 22, and she was an only child. Not that I know of, she replied. We'll monitor everything very closely, the doctor said, but from what I see in your preliminary exams, you have every chance of having a smooth pregnancy. The first few weeks were difficult, not because of morning sickness or physical symptoms, but because of the emotional adjustment of knowing she was embarking on this journey alone. Helen would wake up in the morning and for a few seconds forget that Daniel was no longer there, that she wouldn't have anyone to share the anxiety of the first medical appointments, the joy of hearing the baby's heartbeat for the first time, or the excitement of discovering the sex. It was during the 16-week ultrasound that the first big surprise came. Helen was lying on the examination table, the cold gel spread over her already slightly rounded belly, while Dr. Patricia moved the transducer, looking for the best image of the baby. "How interesting," the doctor murmured, frowning and moving the equipment to different angles. "Any problem?" Helen asked, immediately alert. "No problem," Dr. Patricia said, a smile growing on her face. "But you might want to hold onto the gurney, Helen. You're expecting triplets." The world stopped for a few seconds. "Triplets?" Helen repeated, as if the word were from a foreign language she didn't understand. "3 babies, all seemingly healthy," the doctor confirmed, rotating the monitor so Helen could see. "Look here, here, and here. 3 hearts beating, 3 small human beings growing inside you." Helen looked at the screen and saw 3 small points pulsing rhythmically, 3 lives developing simultaneously in her womb. She felt a wave of emotion so intense that she had to lean on the gurney to keep from fainting. "That's why you're feeling more tired than usual," Dr. Patricia explained. 3 babies demand much more from your body. We'll need to monitor this pregnancy even more closely, and there's a good chance we'll need to schedule a premature delivery around 36 weeks. Triplets. Helen left the office holding the ultrasound images, still processing the information. It wasn't just 1 baby she was carrying, but 3. 3 children who would need her, who would depend on her completely, whom she would raise alone. The news spread quickly through the cafe. Marlene was as emotional as Helen, immediately beginning to plan how to further adapt the workspace to accommodate a mother of triplets. The other cafe regulars were impressed and even more supportive, offering practical and emotional help. "My goodness, Helen," said Carla, an artist who always worked at a corner table in the cafe. "Triplets. You're going to need a real support network." And that's exactly what formed around her. Almost unconsciously, the women of the cafe created a support system that included everything from help carrying heavy groceries to accompanying her to medical appointments when Marlene couldn't. It was as if they all instinctively understood that Helen was facing something extraordinary and that this required an extraordinary response from the community. As the months passed and her belly grew impressively, Helen felt more and more connected to the babies. She talked to them during the day, played classical music for them to listen to, read poetry aloud during calmer afternoons at the cafe. She had chosen not to find out the sexes, preferring the surprise of birth. Daniel tried to contact her twice during the pregnancy. The first was by text message, 3 months after the separation, when someone had probably told him about the triplets. The message just said, "Helen, I heard about the babies. Can we talk?" She deleted the message without replying. The second attempt was a call during her 7th month of pregnancy. Helen was at the cafe when her phone rang, and seeing his name on the screen, she felt a mix of anger and sadness. She answered, but her voice came out cold. "What do you want, Daniel?" "Helen, please listen to me," he said, and she could hear an urgency in his voice that wasn't there during their last conversation. "I know I made a terrible mistake. I know I was cowardly. But these months away from you made me realize—" "Daniel," Helen interrupted, "it's 3 babies. 3. You ran away when you thought it was just 1. Do you really think you could handle 3? "I've grown," he said. "I can—" "No," Helen cut him off. "You had your chance to grow, and you chose to run. These babies don't need a father who only decided he wanted them after they became a statistical curiosity." She hung up and blocked his number. Marlene, who had witnessed the conversation, approached. "You did the right thing," she said, simply. Parenthood isn't something you try when you feel guilty. It's something you embrace from the first moment. As the pregnancy progressed, Helen began to have a strange feeling, as if something significant was about to happen. It wasn't just the normal anxiety of late pregnancy, but a premonition that life's paths were about to cross unexpectedly. The feeling intensified when, during a routine checkup in the 32nd week, Dr. Patricia mentioned that it might be necessary to transfer her to a hospital with a better-equipped neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, in case the babies decided to be born very prematurely. Cardium Hospital has the best NICU in the city, the doctor explained. If there are any complications, it would be the ideal place to ensure the babies receive the best possible care. Helen felt a shiver when she heard the name. Cardium Hospital. Raphael's hospital. The place where everything had begun and, in a way, ended in her previous life. It would be a cruel irony of fate if her children were born exactly there. "Are there other options?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "There are, but honestly, if I were you and carrying triplets, I would choose the best available. Cardium has an exceptional team of neonatologists and state-of-the-art equipment." Helen nodded, but her heart was racing. The probability of encountering Raphael was low. He was a cardiovascular surgeon, not an obstetrician or neonatologist, but the possibility still existed. 2 weeks later, the issue became irrelevant. Helen was working at the cafe on a Thursday afternoon when she felt the first contraction. At first, she thought they were just the normal discomforts of late pregnancy, but when the second contraction came only 15 minutes later, followed by a third 10 minutes later, she knew the time had come. "Marlene," she called, trying to stay calm, "I think it's time." What followed was a whirlwind of activity. Marlene closed the cafe immediately. Carla appeared out of nowhere to help with the bag Helen had prepared, and within minutes she was in the back seat of a taxi on her way to the nearest hospital, which ironically was St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where Felicity had had her daughter. But when they arrived at the hospital, they discovered that the NICU was temporarily closed for renovations. "I need to transfer her to Cardium," said the on-call doctor. "With triplets at 34 weeks, we can't take risks." And so, in an ambulance with sirens blaring, Helen found herself on her way to the hospital she had tried to avoid, carrying 3 babies who were clearly determined to be born that day, in that specific place. During the journey between intensifying contractions, Helen had a silent conversation with the babies. "If you chose this place to be born," she thought, "there must be a reason. I hope you know what you're doing." Cardium Hospital was exactly as she remembered it, modern, efficient, intimidatingly technological. But when she was greeted by the maternity team, Helen immediately felt she was in good hands. The head nurse, a woman named Rose with 20 years of experience in multiple births, took control of the situation with reassuring competence. "Triplets at 34 weeks, active labor," she announced to the team. "We'll prepare her for surgery in case we need an emergency C-section." The next 6 hours were the most intense of Helen's life. The contractions were unlike anything she had imagined, more intense, more frequent. The babies were apparently in a hurry, but also concerned about their positions in the womb. A vaginal birth was possible, but risky. "Helen," said Dr. Mark, the obstetrician who had taken over her case, "I'll be honest with you. The first baby is in a perfect position, but the other 2 are a bit complicated. We can try a natural birth, but it might be safer to schedule a C-section." "What do you recommend?" Helen asked, between 2 especially strong contractions. "We'll try a natural birth with the first baby," the doctor decided. "Depending on how it goes, we'll decide about the other 2. It was midnight when Helen called the only person she knew would come, regardless of the time or circumstances. It wasn't a rational decision, but an emotional one, driven by the need to have someone there who truly knew her, who understood the significance of that moment. "Mrs. Teresa," Helen said, when the familiar voice answered the phone. "Helen? My dear, what time is it for you to call?" "Mrs. Teresa, I'm at Cardium Hospital. I'm in labor. Could you come?" There was a silence on the other end of the line, and Helen wondered if she had made a mistake calling Raphael's mother, but then Mrs. Teresa's voice returned, firm and determined. I'm leaving now, dear. Hold on, I'm coming. Mrs. Teresa arrived at the hospital 45 minutes later, still in her bathrobe and slippers, but with alert eyes and hands full of love. She had been the mother Helen never had since adolescence, and her presence at that moment brought a relief she hadn't realized she needed. "How are they?" Mrs. Teresa asked, sitting by the bed and holding Helen's hand. "Eager to be born," Helen replied, forcing a smile between contractions. "And you called me because you needed someone here, didn't you?" the older woman said with her characteristic wisdom. "Yes," Helen admitted. "I know it's complicated, considering—" "There's nothing complicated about it," Mrs. Teresa interrupted. "You're part of my family, Helen. Always have been, regardless of what happened between you and my son." It was Mrs. Teresa who remembered to notify Raphael. Helen was in full labor, preparing to be transferred to the operating room, when Nurse Rose approached her. "Helen, there's a lady here who says she's your mother-in-law, and she'd like to know if we can notify her son that you're here. She said he's a doctor at the hospital." Helen was silent for a moment. Part of her wanted to say no, wanted to keep Raphael away from the most important and vulnerable moment of her life. But another part, the part that still held some affection for the man she had loved, knew he deserved to know she was there. "You can tell him," she finally said, "but make it clear he doesn't need to come. That I just want him to know I'm here." The message reached Raphael in the middle of a complex cardiovascular surgery. His mother had insisted it be relayed immediately, saying it was a family emergency. When he learned Helen was in maternity, in labor with triplets, Raphael stood motionless in the middle of the procedure. "Dr. Miller," the assistant surgeon called, "is everything all right?" Raphael quickly composed himself, finished the surgery with the professional competence that characterized him, but his mind was completely focused on what he had just discovered. Helen was there, in his hospital, giving birth. The woman he had pushed away because he couldn't have children was having 3 babies at once, alone. When the procedure was over, Raphael went straight to maternity. He didn't know what he intended to do, what he would say if she would want to see him. He only knew he needed to be close somehow. He found his mother in the corridor outside the operating room, where Helen had finally been taken for an emergency C-section when the second baby presented complications. "How is she?" he asked, still in surgical scrubs. "Strong," Mrs. Teresa replied. "Stronger than you ever were, my son." Raphael understood the implicit criticism, but had no energy to argue. "Can I do anything? As a hospital doctor, I can ensure she has the best care." "She's already getting the best care," his mother said. "Dr. Mark is excellent, and the neonatology team has been notified. What she needs now is peace and support, not additional complications." Raphael nodded, understanding that his presence might be more harmful than helpful. But he couldn't pull himself away. He stayed in the corridor, pacing back and forth, waiting for news like any anxious father, though he had no right to that anxiety. At 15 hours and 47 minutes on a rainy Thursday in March, the triplets were born. First came Sophia, weighing 2 kilos and 300 grams, crying vigorously to announce her arrival in the world. 3 minutes later, Gabriel was born, 2 kilos and 100 grams, quieter but equally healthy. Last, Lucas, the smallest of the 3 at 1 kilo and 900 grams, but with perfectly functioning lungs and a gaze that, according to Nurse Rose, was unsettlingly intelligent for a newborn. Helen was conscious throughout the procedure, hearing her children's first cries with tears of joy and exhaustion. When Dr. Mark announced that all were healthy and no NICU admission would be necessary, she finally allowed relief to completely overwhelm her. "They are perfect," the doctor said, showing each baby to her before, handing them over to the neonatology team for initial care. "Triplets born at 34 weeks who don't need respiratory support. It's almost a miracle." When Helen was finally taken to a private room in the maternity ward, with the 3 babies sleeping in cribs beside her bed, she allowed herself to cry tears of pure joy. She had done it. She had brought 3 healthy lives into the world, alone, and they were all well. Mrs. Teresa approached the bed, her eyes teary. "May I hold them?" Helen nodded, watching the woman she considered a second mother pick up Sophia, with the delicacy of someone who had raised her own children. There was something deeply comforting in knowing that her babies would at least have a grandmother to spoil them, even if the circumstances were complicated. It was then that Helen noticed a figure in the doorway of the room. Raphael stood on the threshold, still in surgical scrubs, looking at the scene before him with an expression she couldn't decipher. It wasn't happiness, nor sadness, but something more complex, more profound. Their eyes met across the silent room, and in that moment, Helen saw in Raphael's face something she had never seen before. Absolute regret, mixed with a tenderness she didn't know he possessed. He said nothing, just stood there, observing the babies she had brought into the world, the children who were not biologically his, but who somehow touched something deep in his soul. "Raphael," Helen finally said, her voice hoarse from the exhaustion of childbirth. He approached slowly, as if he were approaching something sacred and fragile. "Helen," he said, his voice low and laden with emotion, They are perfect." Helen nodded, watching as his eyes fixed on the three small faces, each unique and precious. "Sophia, Gabriel, and Lucas," she said, introducing the babies. Raphael repeated the names softly, as if imprinting them on his memory. When Lucas, the smallest, opened his eyes and seemed to look directly at him, Raphael felt something he had never experienced before, the instant and unconditional love that defines parenthood, regardless of biology or circumstances. In that moment, in the silence of the hospital room, with three new lives breathing softly in their cribs, something fundamentally changed. Helen saw in Raphael's gaze the man he could have been if he hadn't allowed fear and wounded pride to dominate his decisions. And Raphael saw in Helen and the triplets a second chance he had never expected to have. Neither of them said anything about the past or the future. They just stood there, 3 adults and 3 babies, while outside, London continued its frantic life, oblivious to the small miracle that had happened inside that hospital room, where destinies crossed again and new possibilities began to take shape. The first few days after the triplets' birth passed in a whirlwind of breastfeeding, diaper changes, and a kind of exhaustion Helen had never imagined existed. Even with the help of nurses specializing in multiple care, she felt completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of the responsibility she had taken on. Sophia was the calmest of the 3. She slept well between feedings and rarely cried without apparent reason. Gabriel was the most vocal. He seemed to have an opinion about everything and didn't hesitate to express it through indignant cries that echoed through the room. Lucas, the smallest, was also the most observant. He stayed awake for long periods, just looking around with those dark eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the world. Helen had planned to stay in the hospital for only 3 days, but the doctors recommended a full week of observation, both for her and the babies. "Premature triplets need extra monitoring," Dr. Mark explained during his morning visit. "We want to be absolutely sure that everyone is gaining weight adequately before releasing them home." It was during that week that Raphael began his discreet visits. On the first day, he appeared during the night shift, when Helen was trying to breastfeed all 3 babies simultaneously, a task that proved physically impossible and emotionally frustrating. "Can I help?" Raphael asked from the doorway, his voice cautious. Helen looked at him exhausted, with disheveled hair and a hospital gown that had seen better days. There was something humiliating about being seen in that state by the man who had once shared her bed, but practical need outweighed wounded pride. "Gabriel has been crying for 15 minutes and I only have 2 arms, she said, gesturing to the vigorously protesting baby in the crib. Raphael approached hesitantly, washed his hands at the room's sink, and with careful movements picked up Gabriel. To Helen's surprise, the baby calmed almost immediately, as if instinctively recognizing he was in competent hands. "He just wanted to be held," Raphael observed, gently rocking the baby. "Sometimes they just need to feel they're not alone." Helen nodded, focusing on feeding Sophia while watching Raphael with Gabriel. There was something natural in the way he held the baby, a delicacy she didn't expect from someone who had never been a father. His large hands seemed enormous compared to Gabriel's tiny body, but his movements were genuinely tender. "You're good with him," Helen commented. I read a lot about pediatrics, Raphael replied, still looking at the baby. It's part of my general medical training. But this, he searched for the words, this is different. It's more instinctive than technical. They remained silent for a few minutes, hearing only the small noises Lucas made sleeping and Gabriel's soft breathing, who was already dozing in Raphael's arms. Helen, Raphael finally said softly, I know I have no right to be here. I know my past choices took away any right I had to be part of this. But, Helen encouraged, unsure if she wanted to hear the rest. But I'd like to help. In any way possible, in any way you'll allow. I'm not asking for forgiveness or trying to go back to the past. I just want to be useful. Helen studied his face, looking for signs of the man who had rejected her 2 years earlier because of his own insecurity. What she saw was different. Maturity where there had once been pride, humility where there had once been arrogance, and above all, a sincerity she didn't remember seeing. Why? She asked. Why do you want to help? Raphael looked at Gabriel sleeping peacefully in his arms and replied with a raw honesty that surprised her. Because when I first saw them, when you said their names, I felt something I had never felt. It wasn't about genetics or biological fatherhood. It was about belonging. As if a part of me I didn't even know was missing had found its place. Helen was silent for a long moment. There was a lot to process, many old wounds, many practical decisions ahead. Raphael, she finally said, I can't give you guarantees about where this will lead. I can't promise we'll be able to work together, nor that I'll be able to trust you again, but she looked at the 3 babies and felt the weight of reality. I need help, and if you're offering genuinely without expectations about our relationship, then yes, I accept. From that night on, Raphael established a routine. He appeared at the hospital during his time off, always asking before entering, always offering practical help without emotional demands. He brought real coffee for Helen, helped with diaper changes, and held the babies so she could shower or get some sleep. More importantly, he began to use his position at the hospital to ensure the best possible care for Helen and the triplets. He spoke with the nutrition team, arranged for a better-equipped nursery, and ensured that specialized nurses were always available. You don't have to do all this, Helen said one afternoon, upon discovering that Raphael had hired a triplet breastfeeding consultant. I know, he replied, but I want to. And before you protest, it's not guilt or an attempt to buy your forgiveness. It's just doing what's within my reach to make your life easier. Helen began to realize that Raphael had truly changed. The changes were not superficial, they were profound. He spoke less about himself and listened more, preferred practical help to grand gestures, and showed infinite patience with the babies. The big turning point came on a difficult night. Lucas and Sophia had fallen asleep, but Gabriel had been crying for almost 2 hours. Exhausted, on the verge of tears, she no longer knew what to do when Raphael entered the room. How long has he been like this? 2 hours, Helen said, her voice trembling. I've tried everything. Raphael picked up Gabriel and began a series of movements Helen had never seen. Gentle rocking, changing positions, and light pressure on the belly. Within 10 minutes, Gabriel was fast asleep. How did you do that? Helen asked, impressed. Colic, Raphael explained. Common in premature babies, especially multiples. The pressure helps relieve trapped gas. He hesitated before continuing. Helen, I've spent the last few weeks studying everything about premature triplet care. I've read scientific articles, talked to specialists, even took an online course. Why would you do that? She asked, incredulous. Because I want to be genuinely useful, not just well-intentioned. If I'm going to be in their lives, I want to be prepared. At that moment, Helen realized that Raphael had, in fact, changed. When the day came to go home, Helen felt both relief and terror. Taking the babies to her Shoreditch apartment was exciting and frightening. Raphael appeared with a proposal. I know you want to go to your apartment, and I respect that, but I want to present you with some practical options. He handed her a folder. I hired a company specializing in multiple care, nurses, doulas, consultants. Helen flipped through the documents, surprised by the level of research. This must cost a fortune. Leave it to me, Raphael said. Please. She hesitated. Financial dependence was dangerous. What if you give up? What if they get attached to you? And then you disappear? Raphael took a deep breath. I can't promise the future, but I can promise I won't run away when it gets difficult. I learned the hard way that running away only causes more pain. Helen looked at the babies, thought about the small apartment, the sleepless nights. Pride was a luxury. Okay, but with conditions. He straightened up. What are they? Helen enumerated. 1. You are not automatically their father. You are someone who helps. If one day we both think it makes sense, we'll talk. 2. I maintain control over all important decisions. 3. If, at any point you feel it's too much, you tell me. Don't disappear. 4. This is about the babies, not about us. Raphael agreed to everything. The first month at home was brutal. Even with professional help, Triplets demanded constant attention. Raphael became indispensable. He helped early, late at night, and whenever Helen needed him. A routine emerged. Raphael had a special connection with each baby. He read to Sophia, calmed Gabrielle, and Lucas seemed to consider him his safe harbor. It was Gabriel who, at a few months old, first said, "Papa." Helen froze. She looked at Raphael, expecting discomfort, but she saw tears. "I don't want to overstep boundaries," he said. "But—" "They are choosing you," Helen completed, realizing that the babies were forming their own bonds. That night, they talked at length about the past, present, and possibilities for the future. "Helen," Raphael said, "these months have been the happiest of my life. I finally understand what it means to love unconditionally. If you are open to the possibility, I'd like to try again. Not like before, like now, as partners, as family." Helen took a deep breath. She wanted to say yes, but fear still existed. "I need time," she said. "It's not just about us. It's about 3 children who don't deserve to have their lives messed up." "I understand. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." That night, listening to the babies breathe, Helen realized the real question was she brave enough to believe that people can change and that love can be rebuilt? Outside, London followed its infinite rhythm, and inside the small apartment in Shoreditch, 4 lives united by pain and hope slept, while the future began to take shape around them. Helen's decision came 3 weeks later, not as a result of a grand revelation or a dramatic moment, but through a series of small instances that, little by little, convinced her that Raphael had truly become the man she had always hoped he would be. The final moment of clarity happened one night, when Lucas suddenly developed a high fever. Helen woke up at 3 in the morning, with the baby crying inconsolably, his little body too hot to the touch. In a panic, she called Raphael without a second thought. He arrived 15 minutes later, still in his pajamas, but with a small medical bag that apparently he always kept ready for emergencies. He examined Lucas with professional competence, but also with a tenderness that only a true father could demonstrate. "It's just a viral infection," he reassured Helen as he administered the medicine he had brought. "The fever should break in a few hours, but we'll monitor him closely." For the next 6 hours, Raphael didn't leave Lucas's side. He checked his temperature regularly, adjusted the medicine doses, and most importantly, held the baby in his arms while Helen tried to get some rest. When the fever finally subsided, and Lucas fell into a deep sleep, Raphael continued to hold him, as if reluctant to let go. "Raphael," Helen said softly, observing the interaction between the man and the child, "you would be a good father to them. In fact, you already are a good father to them." Raphael looked up at her, hope mixed with caution in his gaze. "And that means—" "It means," Helen took a deep breath, "that I'm ready to try again. To rebuild our life together, as equal partners, as a family." What came next was not a passionate reunion of dramatic romance, but rather the quiet recognition of 2 people who had learned that love is not just about feeling, but about the choice you make every day to be present, to stay, to face difficulties together. They decided to take it slow, not only because of their complicated history, but because they wanted to ensure the transition was as smooth as possible for the children. Raphael officially moved into the Shoreditch apartment 6 months later, when all four had adjusted to a routine where his presence felt natural and necessary, not forced. Sophia, Gabriel, and Lucas adapted to the new arrangement with an ease that surprised everyone. To them, Raphael had never been a stranger or a complicated figure from the past. He had always been the constant presence who helped, who cared, who showed up when needed. Integrating their professional lives took longer to sort out. Helen continued to manage the literary cafe, but with Raphael's financial support, she was able to hire more staff and significantly expand its programming. The cafe became known throughout London as one of the leading venues for literary events, book launches, and cultural gatherings. Raphael, for his part, kept his position at Cardium Hospital, but began to focus more on the philanthropic aspects of medicine. He founded an institution to provide healthcare to vulnerable children, something that had always interested him, but which he had never truly pursued when he was solely obsessed with building a financial empire. "It's funny," Helen commented one night as they discussed the foundation's new projects, "how becoming a father made you more interested in helping other children." "It's not funny," Raphael replied seriously. "It's transformative. Having Sophia, Gabriel, and Lucas in my life made me realize that every child deserves to have adults who fight for them, who make sacrifices to ensure they have opportunities to grow and flourish." The first year after their reconciliation was not without challenges. Both Raphael and Helen had developed independent habits during their separation, and learning to merge their lives again required patience and concessions from both sides. There were discussions about parenting styles, conversations about financial boundaries, and, at times, moments when old wounds resurfaced and needed to be addressed again. But the foundation was solid. They had learned to communicate more sincerely, to solve problems before they became crises, and most importantly, to prioritize family above individual preferences when necessary. The children flourished in an environment of stability and love. Sophia proved to be a naturally artistic child, always drawing or inventing melodies with her toys. Gabriel was the most social, charming everyone with his expansive personality and contagious laughter. Lucas remained the most serious of the three, observant and reflective, with a special fascination for books and stories. Raphael adapted to fatherhood with a naturalness that still surprised Helen sometimes. He never missed a bedtime story, always knew which child needed an extra hug after a difficult day, and managed to balance the role of loving father with that of a present partner for Helen. The second major test of their rebuilt relationship came when the children were almost 2 years old. Helen discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the circumstances were completely different from any of her previous pregnancies. She was in a stable relationship, with a supportive partner, secure financial situation, and a strong support network. Still, she hesitated before telling Raphael, the memories of past rejections leaving her apprehensive. When she finally told him during a quiet dinner after the children were asleep, Raphael's reaction was everything she could have wished for. "Seriously?" he asked, a huge smile spreading across his face. "We're having another baby. Are you happy about this?" Helen insisted, wanting to hear clearly. "Helen," Raphael stood up and came to hug her. "I couldn't be happier. Sophia, Gabriel, and Lucas showed me that being a father is the greatest privilege I could have. To have another child with you, a biological child that we both conceived together, it's a gift I never imagined I deserved." This pregnancy was carefully monitored, not because of complications, but because both wanted to ensure everything went as smoothly as possible. At 34, Helen was already considered of advanced, maternal age, and Raphael used all his medical connections to ensure she had access to the best prenatal care available. Unlike the triplets, this pregnancy progressed in a completely normal way. Helen experienced typical morning sickness, gradual weight gain, and all the expected milestones of a healthy pregnancy. Raphael attended all appointments, asked detailed questions about development, and read everything he could about single pregnancies after a multiple gestation. Sophia, Gabriel, and Lucas were initially confused by the idea of a new baby, but their enthusiasm grew as Helen's belly grew too. Raphael spent time explaining that they would be older siblings, that the baby would be smaller and more fragile than them, and that everyone would have to help take care of the new family member. When Helen was 7 months pregnant, they decided to move to a larger house. The Shoreditch apartment had been perfect for a single mother with 3 babies, but a family of 6 needed more space. Raphael found a beautiful house in Notting Hill, close enough to the cafe for Helen to continue working with ease, but with enough bedrooms for each child to have their own space as they grew up. The moving process was an adventure in itself. 3 small children helping to unpack boxes in their own way, while Helen coordinated the furniture arrangement and Raphael handled the more technical aspects of the house. Despite the mess, everything seemed like a natural evolution of the family, not a stressful disruption. The new baby, a girl they named Marina, was born on a sunny September morning. Unlike the dramatic circumstances surrounding the triplets' birth, Marina's delivery was calm and uncomplicated. She arrived exactly on her due date after only 6 hours of labor, healthy and alert. Raphael cried when he held Marina. For the first time, overcome by emotions that were both familiar and entirely new. This was the first child that was biologically his from conception, but curiously, that mattered less than he had always imagined it would. What truly mattered was that she was their 4th child, the continuation and, in a way, the completeness of the family they had built together, more out of love than biology. Sophia, Gabriel, and Lucas met their sister with a mixture of curiosity and protectiveness that melted their parents' hearts. Gabriel immediately declared himself responsible for entertaining Marina, making funny faces to elicit her first smiles. Sophia brought her favorite stuffed animal to offer her sister. Lucas, true to his serious nature, observed Marina for a long time before declaring, "She's small, but she's strong." Adjusting to a family of 6 required logistical planning that would challenge any executive, but somehow they made it work. Raphael and Helen developed a tag team system for raising the children, which allowed both to maintain their professional commitments without any of the 4 children lacking the attention they needed. Marlene, who had already become a kind of unofficial extra grandmother to the children, formalized the role by insisting everyone call her Grandma Marlene. She spent several afternoons a week at the house, helping with the little ones and sharing stories about literature and life with the growing children. Mrs. Teresa, Raphael's mother, also embraced the role of grandmother with an enthusiasm that surprised her son. The woman who was once formal and reserved now spent hours sitting on the floor, playing with her grandchildren, reading stories, and spoiling them in a way she had never allowed herself with Raphael when he was a child. "She's different with them than she was with me," Raphael commented to Helen one day as they watched Mrs. Teresa building block towers with the triplets. "She's different because you're different," Helen replied. "Children bring out new sides in people. Perhaps seeing you as a loving and present father gives her permission to be a more affectionate grandmother." As the children grew, from babies to toddlers and from toddlers to school-age children, the family dynamic evolved naturally. Sophia showed an artistic talent that Helen encouraged with art classes and creative projects. Gabriel's sociable nature was channeled into sports and activity groups where he could develop leadership. Lucas's love for books and stories turned into a passion for learning, which his parents encouraged with library visits and educational activities. Marina, raised in a rich environment of affection and siblings, grew into a confident and cheerful child who could assert herself among the 3 older ones without losing her own personality. Family traditions emerged almost without them realizing it. Sunday mornings became pancake day, when Raphael made elaborate breakfasts while the children helped, or more precisely, turned the kitchen into a happy chaos. Thursday evenings were reserved for story night at the literary cafe, where the whole family participated in literary events, and the children gradually learned to love books and culture. Annual trips to the beach turned into grand adventures, requiring careful planning and endless suitcases, but creating memories that would last forever. Raphael, who once traveled alone to expensive destinations, discovered that building sandcastles with the children and sharing an ice cream with Helen on a crowded beach was infinitely more rewarding than any luxury resort he had ever known. Professional success took on a different meaning for both of them. Helen's cafe continued to prosper, becoming a landmark in London's literary scene. Her events began to appear in major newspapers, and some famous authors insisted on launching their books there. Raphael's foundation greatly expanded its reach, offering medical care to thousands of vulnerable children across the UK. He began to receive awards and recognition for his social work, but realized that the accolades meant far less than a single smile from one of his children. Success, he told an interviewer in a profile about his philanthropic work, used to be about personal achievement and financial gain. Today it's about the legacy you leave for the next generation, about the world you help build for your children to inherit. 5. Years after the triplets' birth, in their Notting Hill home, during Sophia, Gabriel and Lucas's 5th birthday party, Helen found herself observing a scene that seemed straight out of a dream. 4 children running around the balloon-decorated backyard, Mrs. Teresa helping other neighborhood mothers serve cake, Marlene organizing games, and Raphael in the middle of it all, managing the barbecue and mediating an argument between Gabriel and another child about the rules of a game. "Remember when you thought you couldn't have children?" Helen asked Raphael later that night, when the children were finally asleep and they were tidying up the party mess. Raphael paused in the middle of folding a tablecloth and looked around. Empty cake plates, scattered toys, colorful drawings used in the decorations. "Ironic, isn't it?" he said. "I thought my worth as a man was linked to my ability to father biological children, and I discovered that my worth as a father has nothing to do with biology, and everything to do with showing up, being present, and choosing to love unconditionally." "And would you change anything?" Helen asked. "About the path here, about the pain we went through?" Raphael thought seriously before answering. "I would change my initial reaction to your triplet pregnancy. I would change the fact that you went through the pregnancy and birth alone. I would change the fact that I was the source of so much pain." "But," Helen encouraged, realizing there was more, "but I wouldn't change the fact that we both had to grow until we became people capable of sustaining this level of love and responsibility. Perhaps if we had stayed together from the beginning, trying to force the relationship when we were still immature and full of fear, we would have ended up destroying each other. Maybe. We needed to get lost to truly learn how to find each other." Helen agreed. She never would have imagined in the darkest moments that such pain would eventually transform into wisdom, that loss would lead to a much deeper appreciation of love when it returned. "And now?" she asked. "Where do we go from here?" Raphael dropped the tablecloth, pulled Helen into his arms, surrounded by the silent remnants of the life they had built. "Now," he said, "we keep showing up. We keep choosing each other and the children every day. We keep building this life one day, at a time, through the good times and the difficult ones, in sickness and in health, through sleepless nights and happy mornings." "That sounds dangerously like wedding vows," Helen joked, smiling. "Perhaps it is," Raphael replied. "Perhaps everything we've done these past 5 years has been an extended wedding ceremony, proving to ourselves that we are ready for a lifelong commitment." 6 months later, during an intimate ceremony in their backyard, with the 4 children as witnesses and Marlene officiating the wedding, thanks to her credentials as a civil celebrant, Raphael and Helen officially married. Not because they needed a document to validate what they lived, but because they wanted to mark the moment they consciously chose to formalize the promise of the future they were building together. Sophia, now 5, was the flower girl, taking her role very seriously. Gabriel, also 5, carried the rings with a pride that made his parents laugh. Lucas, thoughtful as ever, wrote his own version of a wedding speech, which basically consisted of observations about how everyone seemed much happier when they were together. Marina, almost 3, enjoyed being the center of attention and loved wearing a beautiful dress. The ceremony was simple, focused on promises to continue supporting each other, maintaining the family they had built, and never again letting fear guide decisions that affected their love. "Raphael," Helen said in her vows, "you taught me that sometimes people need to break completely. before they learn how to fit back together. You showed me that love isn't about finding the perfect person, but finding someone willing to grow and change alongside you. Helen, Raphael replied, you taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward even with fear. You showed me that family isn't about DNA or traditional structures, but about people who choose to love each other through everything life brings. The reception was in the backyard, transformed with string lights and flowers, with the presence of close friends, family, and literary cafe regulars, who over time had become part of their extended family. The children played until they fell asleep, while the adults talked, laughed, and celebrated a love story that took years to reach its proper conclusion. Later, when the last guest had left and the children were sleeping in beds decorated with some of the ceremony flowers they insisted on keeping, Raphael and Helen sat on the porch swing they had installed when they moved in. "Do you think this is our happily ever after?" Helen asked, her head resting on his shoulder, swinging slowly in the warm night air. "I don't think it's an end," Raphael replied. "I think it's just the beginning of whatever comes next, but I know that whatever it is, we'll face it together." Around them, London vibrated with its constant energy, millions of people searching for their own versions of love, family, and happiness. Inside the Notting Hill house, 4 children slept peacefully, secure in the certainty that they were loved unconditionally by 2 parents who learned that the deepest families are not, necessarily, those created by chance or biology, but those built deliberately, with care, and with an endless commitment to be present for each other amidst all of life's unexpected challenges and joys. In the end, their story was not about a perfect love that overcomes all obstacles, but about imperfect people learning to love better through experience, growth, and a firm commitment to choosing each other and their children above fears and limitations. It was a story about second chances, about family built by choice and not just by circumstance, and about a love that grew stronger as it was tested, rather than weakening in the face of difficulties. Some stories end with, "and they lived happily ever after." Theirs ended with, "and they lived, consciously and gratefully one day at a time," building happiness through small daily acts of love, commitment, and mutual grace, for themselves and for the 4 children who taught them that the greatest love stories are not written in grand gestures, but in countless simple moments where one chooses to stay, to care, and to grow together, no matter what happens.